The four most striking things about what the changes in Britain between 1700 and 1850 are the following. The changes that happened are all interlinked with each other, everything having a knock-on effect, sustaining and giving way to further societal shifts. Never before had so much change happened in such a concentrated time, the likes of which it could be argued could only be compared to the arrival of the internet. And the changes that happened fundamentally affected everybody's life in one way or another. And finally, the changes that occurred could be seen as advancement. However, it could be said that a nation's prosperity had hid a deep societal trauma. In 1700, the majority of the populace in Britain were living in a rural area. Unlike the hub of trade and services our dominant cities are today, the powerhouse of Britain very much came from these rural areas. In these areas, a common manner of work in the early 18th century was the cottage industry. This was mass manufacturing, but on a domestic scale. Individual households would produce items from the home and sell them on. The production of these goods and this manufacturing has been given the term proto-industrialisation. Daniel Defoe, in his book, A Tour Through the Whole Island of Britain, he describes the cottage industry thus: a house full of lusty fellows, some at the dye vat, some dressing the cloths, some in the loom, some one thing, some another, all hard at work. The majority of productive output, though, in the early 18th century did come from agriculture. And as this slide shows, it wasn't just the rearing of livestock and the growing of crops. It provided the majority of raw material for industry, both rural and urban. Based on the principles of the Magna Carta in 1215, Britain's rural areas at this time were held in an open field system. Commoners had traditional rights over the land where they could do the following things. This land would be owned by a collection of people or just one individual. This land had no boundaries, and pre-1700 accounted for nearly half of Britain. Around 1650 though, this land then began to be enclosed together, forming larger farms. This was done via the Enclosure Acts. Once enclosed, this newly formed land was restricted to just one owner. This was done either by buying the common rights to accomplish exclusive rights or by forced enclosure, known as parliamentary enclosure, which was often met with riots or bloodshed. It's because it led to a huge surplus of labour and forcing migrations from rural areas, substantially speeding up urbanisation. Between 1650 and 1900, there were 5,200 Enclosure Acts enacted. The Enclosure Acts led to massive changes in agriculture, meaning more productive methods could then be used. Developed on the continent pre-1700, the agricultural industry in Britain adopted something called the Norfolk Four-Course rotation system. This was a revolutionary technique, meaning that you could convert land between arable farming and pastoral. It meant greater profits and more versatile land. This left the price of grain cheap and real wages high. Whilst the staple diet was beer and bread, the more that the grain supplies were high and was cheap, people could afford to eat dairy and meat products, giving farmers more incentive to turn to pastoral farming. These techniques, along with the national clawback following the losses of the English Civil War, meant that Britain experienced an agricultural boom in the early 1700s. And as British agriculture did feed more people, there were many outcomes that led to societal change. With this growth and working productivity being so high, it led to the population increasing. Certain people could afford to eat more, or at least at a cheaper rate, allowing a better standard of living and being able to afford more on industry. The agricultural production surplus sustained migration into towns. It also sustained industrial and population growth within these towns. However, not all of these changes were positive. It allowed for a larger population to be fed, but without any change to their standard of life. As these new techniques in farming led to population growth, it also led to surplus labour, meaning higher unemployment and increased poverty levels. This graph shows how employment shifted from agriculture and then more to industry. It could be said that all of this led to an agricultural involution, where agricultural output led to such a massive population growth that, along with societal confidence, that by the 18th century, early 19th century, the industry simply couldn't sustain the rural population. It is argued that it led to pressure on the land, smaller margins and further poverty. An example of agricultural involution is the Irish potato famine. This is where society becomes overly reliant on a yield, only for the yield to effectively fail the populace. It's identified by historians as a self-defeating process. This poverty is a major factor for mass migration from rural areas to urban areas and shift to a more industrial way of life. However, it wasn't the only change that sustained industrialisation. The population grew heavily in the later part of the 18th century, as this graph shows. This was because, as mentioned, nationally, the agricultural output was higher leading up to the 1760s. But by the 1740s, births had dramatically overtaken deaths. More people were generally having more children, There were better medicines and better sanitation. This, however, did not serve to counter the cholera outbreak of the 19th century. This massive surge in population only led to increase in demand, furthering the need for industrialisation. Arguably, more than anywhere else, Britain was more favoured towards the technologically innovative entrepreneur. In Joel Mokyer's 2006 revised paper on entrepreneurship and the Industrial Revolution, he argues that sustained industrialisation is associated with the institutions such as the rule of law, intellectual property rights and government legislation that particularly favoured industrialists. However, it's becoming more recognised historically that less formal institutions were becoming more common amongst individuals engaging in commerce. Mokyer counter-argues this, that these were soon in the form of accepted codes of behaviour, such as patterns of belief, trust relations and social patterns. As if to say, a handshake in a public house could be worth as much as a promissory note from a gentleman. Mokyer goes even further. For more than a century before industrialisation, barriers to entry to industrial markets were being broken down and eroded, often due to non-compliance. By the 19th century, it was only really the high-ranking military, the civil service or politics that were generally reserved for rich landowners or aristocrats, giving industrialists a seat at the table. Industrialists also generally had high levels of business acumen. People like Richard Arkwright or Isambard Brunel, whose inventions put Britain at the forefront of industrial change. Financial change in Britain from 1750 was a major part of sustaining industrial growth. With more money available for people willing to create wealth, it meant high investment with loans from local sources, allowing for industrial expansion, all leading to increased profits for industrialists. Economic growth grew to levels that could sustain industrialisation. Whilst it was slow in the early parts of the 1700s, rising at just 0.7%, GDP was rising at a rate of 1.3% per capita by the 1780s. By the 1700s, London had become a hub of financial activity. It was this financial bridge that linked Britain to Europe. The Napoleonic Wars in France had various effects on Britain that contributed to industrialisation. Defence was one of Britain's largest expenses. Now, despite the government's inclination to borrow funds for the war, it wasn't enough to sustain such a continued period of conflict. The unpopular introduction of income tax in 1798 laid heavily on the taxpayer, which only led to more mechanisation in a bid to squeeze industrial profit. There was a huge decline in consumption also, therefore requiring more industry to make up for lost profits. There was more mechanisation within industry required simply just to support the war, and winning the war also left Britain being a major global superpower. This led to overseas expansion, causing more industrialisation throughout the world. It's also worth noting that while the French armies were instructed by Napoleonic generals to live off the land they fought on, Field Marshal General Wellington was conscious that British forces on the peninsula should be seen as liberators and not conquerors. To this end, as well as military supplies being shipped to the army, food supplies were shipped from the British ports, primarily shipped to Lisbon in Portugal. Whilst this was very costly, it did encourage industrialisation throughout Britain. Now, whilst the Whigs huffed and puffed their way to power, achieving an unassailable government by 1714, they very much favoured a protectionist policy. When the Tories gained power, however, they flew the flag of free trade, allowing overseas trade to become a massive chunk of Britain's economy. With London becoming such a financial centre with such far-reaching naval presence, it only served to open up foreign markets more than ever before. This led to the improvement of ports, the creation of new ones, and a mercantile boom. Having discussed the causes for industrialisation and the reasons for its sustaining, it's time to discuss the nature of the change. It is these changes that give the period the name, the Industrial Revolution. The textiles industry was a substantial slice of Britain's economy during the Industrial Revolution. Where before they were created with the cottage industry, textiles were soon mass-produced in hydro-powered mills. With new working formats increasing profits, it paved the way for innovation. This innovation came in the form of textile machines. They included the spinning jenny, the first machine to improve on the spinning wheel, the water frame by Richard Arkwright, the spinning mule by Samuel Crompton, and the power loom, 1785 by Edmund Cartwright. This was particularly important because it was the first automatic weaving machine. These textile machines significantly reduced labour and substantially increased profits. It led to more investment in industry, and further mechanisation was required to supply the demand. As most of these inventions were too large for domestic settings, outgrowing proto-industrialisation, to industrialists it was a golden opportunity. for expansion into mills, and it became the birth of the factory system. Before 1760, growth was fairly slow, with the main source of power being either hydro or horsepower. The invention of the steam engine was so significant, it put paid to the name Industrial Revolution. When Thomas Newcomen invented the first steam engine in 1712, it allowed for water to be pumped out of the mines, meaning Britain's mine coal reserves could be exploited. More coal led to a run on steam innovation, and further innovation led to James Watt's patenting an improved and more productive machine in 1769, with many improved models being patented throughout the latter half of the 18th century. The steam engines were introduced to many forms of industry as mass production grew. It meant that industrialists were no longer limited to the opportunities of hydropower, and soon all the mills and factories were run via steam, increasing production and profit. By 1800, there were 2,000 steam engines in Britain. With Britain's advantage of coal now being mined to fuel production on an industrial level, it lessened the need for imported coal. As Britain's coal production soared to fuel the steam engines of Britain, as this graph shows, it meant that the concentrated industry near water sources was no longer necessary, and industry could move to where industrialists could afford to invest in it, the preferred option being urban areas. Coal was one of the primary enablers of industrialisation and was the perfect addition to mechanisation within industry. Another example of an industry that benefited hugely from steam power was the iron industry. Steam made it not only possible for a substantial increase in production, as this graph shows, but also the quality of the raw material increased. Soon iron was the most reliable and durable product, with such an increase from 1780 onwards, Britain was soon scattered with iron structures. With the iron industry booming, it led to Britain's first steam railway being invented, and in 1825 the Stockton to Darlington opened. These two graphics illustrate how fast the railway systems in Britain developed between 1845 and 1852. As well as providing labour for construction workers known as navvies, rail soon became an effective use of transport for fuel, goods, building materials and soon people. With journey times massively decreased, Britain's countryside was paved with railway lines connecting all the major cities and ports. Another means of connecting Britain was utilising her natural waterways. Now it's connected these waterways further with the construction of canals. These canals were also used to transport goods to and from the ports of the cities throughout Britain. Gregory Clark notes in his 2005 paper, entitled The British Industrial Revolution, that with the population tripling since 1700, that by 1850 the British Isles were 1.8% of the world's population, and yet only 0.16% of the world's landmass. Despite this, Britain produced 2/3 of the world's coal output, half of the world's cotton, textiles and iron output. Output was higher per worker than in any other country, and GDP was fast growing, well over 3% per capita per year. Now, with the working class population now very much following the money and mass migration into urban areas, we have seen how the population grew to extreme levels. This graph shows the level of income diminishing from agriculture and rising in urban areas from 1700 to 1840. Manchester, for example, had gone from being a small market town of less than 10,000 people to 400,000 souls by 1850. This mass of low-paid labour working in gruelling conditions lived in abject poverty for their entire life, with no avenue out of the industrial work they'd become accustomed to. These vast pools of labour are what became commonly known as the working class. They developed social attitudes and consensus based on their bottom-line social standing. With this migration into towns, the more wealthy population moved to the outskirts of these growing metropolises. This became known as the creation of a suburban middle-class population, and the sociological theory of class consciousness was theorised by Karl Marx in 1848. These two class systems had huge conflicts of interest, and each acting according to their own interests. Some of these are exploitation. Whilst new factory systems made productive output soar, it hid a dark reality. Employees were forced to work long hours in grim conditions. As productivity was now driven by machines rather than daylight, typical working shifts were between 12 and 14 hours a day, with only Sundays off. The use of child labour was common. Factory owners took children, subscribing them into apprentice systems. Whilst lodging and meals were provided, once within this system, it was illegal to leave until they turned of age. Many mill owners even lied about the age of the children to gain more years' labour. These children developed bone conditions such as rickets. With no health and safety practice, serious injuries were common, and in many mills it often resulted in death. Families that worked in these factories were often known to never leave their places of employment their entire life. But riots and violence were common during the beginning of the 1800s. With so many of the population desperate, living in poverty and disease, with poor health and no sanitation, rioting was the only way they could feel represented. One faction of this was the rise of Luddism, a violent societal response birthed in Nottinghamshire, occurring mainly in the Midlands up to the northwest England. These Luddites, commonly known as machine breakers, were self-employed weavers and workers within proto-industrialisation. They sought to render factories unoperational, destroying machines they saw as replacing the labour force. Now, with the French Revolution occurring only in the latter half of the 18th century, the government were always fearing a full-scale rebellion and were quick to put these riots down using military or local yeomanry. An example of this is the aptly named Battle of Peterloo. On the 16th of August 1819, on St Peter's Field in Manchester, a group of 60,000 people gathered to demand parliamentary representative reform. Cavalry charged head into the crowd, killing 18 and injuring many. Now, Chartism was a grassroots working class response between 1838 and 1858. Very strong in the West Midlands and the valleys of South Wales, it was a non-violent movement mobilising around petition and peaceful protest through mass gathering. In 1800, only 5% of the population had the right to vote. Its aim, therefore, was democracy-based, and via a People's Charter of 1838, some of the demands were male suffrage for every male over the age of 21, a secret ballot to protect the integrity of the individual voter, and abolition of property qualification for MPs. Now, while these demands seemed unrealistic and somewhat unachievable, it being many years before male suffrage was gained, it was the first stake in the ground towards what we now know as universal representation. Now, although the government response was slow and often questionable, during this period many policies were introduced as a means of countering the plight of the poor. Some of these are the Gilbert's Act, which attempted to extend the range of poor relief, the Combination Act, making it illegal to form a trade union, the Reform Act, significant changes to the electoral system, the Factory Act, regulating child labour, the Poor Law, making it poor relief so unpleasant no one would want it, Miners and Colliers Act, took women and children out of the mines, and the Public Health Act, focused on water supply, drainage and environmental health. The working class slums in Britain were known to be some of the worst living conditions in Europe. However, many of these acts encouraged more mechanisation within industry, just to counter the hit on profits felt by further regulation. But following intense public pressure and class struggle, the Combination Act was repealed in 1824, allowing for strikes and employee organised response. Now, whilst other acts were introduced to immediately counter this working class kickback, it did eventually lead to the birth of the trade unionism. In 1868, the Trade Union Congress was formed. To conclude, what is clear is that without the innovation of the few and the desperate struggle of the impoverished many, we would not have workers' rights, health and safety law, environmental law, trade unionism, universal representation, and a general consensus to strive for innovation and well-being. This is the references and bibliography for all the content you've heard today. For clarity, it will be attached to the portal. Thanks for listening.